Good morning, everyone. I'm Hilary Stupa. I'm a developer with Qdabra Software. I am glad to see all of you today. And we are going to talk about using Flow to create PDFs from our data. So here's an agenda. We are going to review the types of Word content controls currently supported in Populate a Microsoft Word template action. I want to take a look at what's available to us to use these Word Online connectors. We're going to add controls to the document to create the template. I'm not going to walk through the whole thing, but there's a few highlights that I want to show you. We're going to use some actions in Flow to get and shape our data appropriately. There are a couple things there that I want to make you aware of. And then we are going to create a PDF. First, I'm going to launch a quick poll. So let's see, it looks like I've got it open. And it is just, I'm just curious what you guys are using here in the Power Platform. What tools are you using? It helps us kind of ascertain what sorts of things, might be useful in the future. And hey, just don't answer if you're not using any of them, because it occurs to me that I should have had a none option. So that's fine too. So at any rate, it looks like Power Apps and Flow are getting a little more use than Power BI, which is interesting to me. I've used Power Apps and Flow more than I have Power BI, but Karu, one of my colleagues, is very skilled with Power BI. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll, and hopefully that means my screen is sharing again. You guys know I'm always a little concerned about my capabilities with these technologies, and we will just get this party started. So be aware that the connector we're looking at today is both premium and preview. The Power Apps and Flow licensing FAQ, which there's a link to that in these slides, so you can look at it in more detail, states that a standalone Power Apps or Microsoft Flow plan is required to access premium connectors. So this is not a connector that's just included with Office 365. I have feelings about that, but I'm not going to express them. But be aware of that. It looks like in Logic Apps, it's considered a standard connector. So you may also want to keep that in mind. Perhaps Logic Apps is going to be a better price point for you. I know we had a webinar with Svetlana discussing kind of the impacts of the licensing changes on Flow. As far as it being in preview goes, I've seen a number of Power Platform connectors that have stayed in preview for quite some time. And I personally have been comfortable using preview connectors. However, I'm not in charge of making sure somebody's medical information gets to the right person, or something of that nature. Your business may have a different risk tolerance than the types of activities I've been using these connectors for. So preview often means that the connector may be subject to change. And what's the impact of that to you? It just means you need to be aware that it could change underneath you and that there might be things you would need to fix in your flow. So if you're using preview connectors, keep a close eye on those Flow Air emails. Don't ignore them. Check on your flows occasionally. Make sure you don't have unknown errors, and set up some air handling in your flows. That's something we should do a webinar on, huh? Flow air handling. When you guys are done, when we're done with the webinar and you guys get the survey, be sure you take it, because I'm asking about what Flow and Power Apps topics would you like? And if air handling and Flow is interesting to you, there's some really great design patterns out there. So let me know if you would like a webinar on that, because I'm happy to do one. I'm fascinated with air handling. It makes me so happy when airs are handled well. So the good news on this connector is that the documentation is robust, it's helpful, it's up to date. It's got some tips covering a few of the things we're going to look at today. And a lot of times, I know I push everyone to the documentation. I think a lot of times our Power Platform documentation has been in flux, and it's been a little challenging in terms of its thoroughness. This particular documentation is good, and we're going to take a look at that right now. So I'm going to break this up into two demos. We're going to look at the Word piece, and then we're going to look at the Flow piece. And I am sometimes not great about checking the question widget here during my presentation, and I leave you guys hanging till the end, but I'm going to try very hard to remember to check that question widget after each demo so that we have a little more real-time kind of feedback on that. So let us take a look first at the documentation, and I've got that right here. I've highlighted this particular piece on what was supported, and so this is something you should look at before you get started. It helps you with your design pattern, right? If you know in advance what content controls you can use, it helps you understand what your limitations are when you get to work. You can see, you guys, that I've already voted this page helpful. I am doing my part to provide feedback. So limitations, there's a few things here you should be aware of. And here's the sections I was talking about. There's a guide for using repeating sections. There's a guide for using images. And then there's a guide for formatting, as well as then throttling limits and information about the actions. So, do check out this documentation if this is an approach you are interested in trying, because it is helpful and it will help you get things set up. So my demo scenario here, it comes from a real world client situation. I've changed things because I wanted to make sure that this was stuff I could share with you. But in this client scenario, what they have is they do business as a few different companies. They have an invoicing process. They need their invoices to look attractive. They've got their invoice data in a few places. They've got everything's in SharePoint. So they've got customers in SharePoint. They've got invoice kind of header information, your sort of high level kind of stuff like the invoice number and the date and the estimated arrival. All of those things are kind of high level invoice header information. And then they've got their description information, which is repeating the actual things that are going on this particular invoice. The companies may be in different areas, so this footer could change, and the payment terms might be different. For the customers themselves, you've got your customer information, but also for this particular client that I worked with, they have an international customer list. So sometimes the dollars is US and sometimes it's euros. They also had a customer weight measure because there was an additional kind of a weight column here, and I didn't include that. The general idea, though, is that there were certain attributes that belong to the customer that need to be reflected here. Okay, so this is sort of the scenario we're working with. And again, I'm using SharePoint lists because first off, it was the scenario I had been dealing with, but also just because for purposes of demos and webinars, it's really quick and easy to set up. That doesn't mean there's any restriction here. If you can get your data out of your data store using Flow, you can use this technique. It would just change where your data came from. And so, be aware that this is not restricted in any way to just SharePoint lists, okay? So the first thing you need is the Developer tab in Word. If you don't have the Developer tab, you go to File, you find Options, and then you find Customize Ribbon. And right here under Customize Ribbon, we've got our tabs, and you can select Developer. Okay, so you need that Developer tab. In my sample invoice here, I have the image up in the header. You will see when I switch over and show you my template with the content controls that image is no longer in the header. I found in my testing that image content controls are supported with this action. However, if that image is in the header, the picture fails. And I ended up with my final output was saying something about how the file could not be found. So, it says, I think that it is supported. It's not supported in the header. It's one of those things that I'm thinking about posting to the Flow forum on because I'm curious if this is a known issue. Regardless, just be aware of that. Okay, so if you're going to use images, put them in the body for right now. Could that change? Sure. Could it get fixed? Absolutely. So in general, to add a content control, I like starting with text, with sample text like this. And then we go to Developer. This is not supported. That's rich text. This is supported. This is supported, right? Combo box, drop down, and this guy over here, the repeating section. Those are supported controls from our documentation. So I'm going to hit plain text here. And then because I don't like the fiddliness of having to go reselect this, I always just rename my thing right as I grab it. Now, when we look at the flow piece of this, you will find that this action is going to show you what I'm going to refer to as key value pairs. And so what it will show you is on the left-hand side, it will show you whatever's in this title for the content control properties. And on the right-hand side, where you're going to be putting in your dynamic values, it's going to show you if there's any text here, it's going to show you what the text is. Now, I personally think that help text is very helpful. And I also think dealing with this after it has all these little content controls in it is much easier if I have some sample text there. I've got a larger thing to grab a hold of. So just give these things meaningful names, customer name, right? And you say, okay. And then off you go to the races, right? Customer address, just boom, properties, right? Give it good names, keep the name of the object in there because if you don't, it's going to be very confusing if you don't know whether it's the customer or the company address when you go to populate this from your flow. Keep in mind, you're not probably going to be looking at this when you're populating it from the flow. Make your own life easy. It's sort of like with InfoPath, right? Be sure you know what your fields are. Don't name anything rule 1. Okay, so let's look at what has to happen here in the repeating section because this is a little more interesting. So I'm going to select these rows and I'm going to delete them. And the reason I'm doing that is because I only need one row for my repeating thing. Okay, so I'm going to say delete rows because the thing repeats. You guys are InfoPath developers probably. You're used to dealing with a repeating table with a single row. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select this entire row. Now we are working from the outside in when we do this repeating. And that's the thing I wanted to make sure y'all knew about. So we say this thing, this row that I have now selected, this is a repeating section. And I'm going to name it right away. And I'm going to call it invoice detail item, right? Because it's a single item. Okay, and I'm going to say, okay, so now I've got my invoice detail item, and now I can take care of all of these different guys inside of here. He's plain text, his property is, right, invoice detail description. Now, these are probably not the names I used in my final output. I'm not sure offhand what names I used, but that's where things are at. And one other thing I just want to tell you, there isn't a good way to format numbers. Okay, so if you need that trailing 0 in there, if your data is a numeric data type, right? It's not necessarily going to have that trailing data coming from SharePoint. It's going to be 154.9, and you will end up finding out that there is no, at this point, expression and flow that we can use to format that number. People have some bodacious expressions out there on the web that you can use if you really, really want a 14-paragraph expression just for a formatted number. In the end, for this client, I ended up using a calculated column that basically just had the number formatted in SharePoint as a string, and that worked out just fine for this purpose. But do be aware of number formats, that there is no way of saying, like you can in Excel, right? Excel, you can set a pretty number format. No way to do that here. So I'm going to close this guy without saving him. I'll send him along with the webinar packet. And let's take a look at the one that I uploaded. Okay, so as I mentioned, I took this image out of the header. Now, if we look back at our documentation and we take a look at now, the guide for repeating section basically tells you what I just told you. Make sure you're putting stuff inside your repeating section. For using the Word Online, for using images, you can see right here it says add the image content controller. Don't delete the placeholder image. Okay, and so that's what I went ahead and did not do, was delete the placeholder image. If we scroll down here, we can see all of these are content controls. I put all of my address stuff together in one line, and you'll see how we put that together in Flow with a basic concat. Here's my header stuff. Here's my description stuff. This right here is a content control, so I know the customer currency measure. Here's my company stuff, additional company stuff. Here's some more company stuff down here in the footer. All of these things will change based on the company that made the sale. And before we go take it well, we're not to the flow yet, so we'll look at the list when we get to the flow. But I did want to just kind of show you, I don't know how everybody else thinks, right? But I think on paper, or well, what substitutes for paper in my world. And so, when I was getting ready to create my lists, because I didn't already have them, I just sort of walked through as I was working on this and made a list of, what belongs to the company, what belongs to the customer, what belongs to the invoice header. If you already have your data someplace, you won't need to do this process. But if you don't, I really encourage you, as you kind of work through, if you're automating something entirely new, I encourage you, as you're sort of working through it, to think about what belongs to who. It makes your process easier, when you get ready to get your data set up. So that is the Word portion. We get that put together, we get everything added, we get all our content controls in there, and then we upload it to SharePoint, and then we are ready to use it. Okay, so where are we going to use it? We're going to use it in Flow. And as I've already said, your data can come from wherever, right? If you were to decide to do something, okay, so I discourage two here. If you were to decide to do something like two, like you had not a ton of data and you just want to pass it directly in, well, first off, if you don't have a ton of data, you would probably just use some of the free options like the OneDrive converter and just kind of create some HTML on the fly for that, right? I don't know that I would use this approach unless I had something that was structurally challenging to create and maintain. I liked this word template approach for this client because it created something for them that was maintainable. They weren't concerned about the connector cost, and this gives them something that they can easily maintain. They can change the word template, they can kind of rearrange things if they want to, they can add new controls and update the flow. It was a workable solution for them. So the reason I wouldn't probably go directly from Power Apps to the flow is because I think anything that would leverage this process probably is in need of, it's probably something with more data. Now, if you're doing Power Apps to SharePoint, you would really want to think about, well, in any of these cases, you really want to think about your trigger if you have a parent-child relationship, okay? So if you were to use when an item is created or modified in a SharePoint list for your trigger, for example, how do you know all the child items are there, right? So the approach I ended up taking here was I did go from Power Apps to Flow, but the only piece of information I passed was the header item ID, okay? And so I called the flow from Power Apps with the header item ID. That meant in Flow, what I did was I submitted my form, and then I submitted all of my child items using Patch. And after all of those submissions succeeded, I was able to go ahead and say, okay, here's my header ID. Now run the flow to go generate the PDF. Okay, so I'm not trying to make this sound overcomplicated. You'll see the sample I've got, I'm just using a scheduled process, and there's no need to make it overcomplicated. You simply want to think, if you're dealing with repeating data, you simply want to think carefully about how will I know when all of my items are there, right? How do I not create this prematurely? And so you could add a column to your parent SharePoint list called Generate PDF. And after you submitted your form and after you submitted your child items, you could set that to go, right? There's options. At any rate, your data can come from wherever you need it. Your trigger can be whatever you need it to be. I'm just encouraging you, as always, to think about these design decisions. Don't just go in there all helter-skelter, plan first. There's only 2 actions available for this connection. We're going to look at both of them. It could be in your process. You just need the final output to be a Word document. Some people do. I like saving both the Word document and the PDF because then if there's something not quite right, it does give the end consumer an opportunity to go fix it up, go change it. So I think it's, unless there is a requirement for you that it be only completely, straight to PDF so the user cannot change it, saving the Word document someplace someone can get to it is sometimes useful. special data type handling. We looked briefly at how to set up a repeating control. We're going to look at this flow and talk about what do we do with our repeating data. Why is repeating data always so hard, right? What are we going to do with it? We're going to create an array. And then for images, we talked about the documentation. It says specifically, what we have to pass in for our image. My images are attachments in a SharePoint list, and we'll take a look at those lists. So off to another demo, and let me see if I can find my taskbar again. Let's take a look first at my lists. Okay, so, well, here's my templates library. I just put that in my documents, and you can see here in my document, that's my template. That's that invoice template with the content controls, okay? Here's my library where the invoices are gonna get dropped. Okay, my company's library. And you can see here that in my company's library, everybody has different payment terms. All my companies are located someplace different. That's what's going to show up in the footer. And you can't see the attachments, but each of these has an attachment that is their logo. Here we go into our customers. So we've got our various customers. We've got a customer ID of sorts there, additional customer information. I've already got data here in my invoice header. So here's my information about who sold it, payment terms, all of those other header information pieces. These are lookups. We've got a lookup to our customer and so forth. Okay, here's the details. Here's what everybody was sold. It links back to the invoice. Okay, so there's my data structure, and you'll see it pretty much matches what I had in my, my little notepad file. So in my flow, I started with a recurrence. Now, on the one hand, a recurrence makes things a little messier because I'm getting all of those invoice headers, I'm looping through them, and for each one I'm getting all of the details. So you'll find this flow gets nested pretty deeply, and that's okay. But just be aware of it. So I'm initializing some variables here. I've got my list item array, an empty array, and I'll show you why I'm using that. Grand total, row grand total, and file name. So these are the variables that I'm initializing. It would be lovely if they didn't have to be initialized kind of at the outmost level of the flow, but we're not there yet with flow. So to start with, I'm just getting all of my header list items. In the real world, you would probably have a way of determining what had already been invoiced, and you would probably populate the column once the invoicing was done. In demo world, I'm just getting all 4 of them. Here's my for each loop. And so for each of these invoice headers, we're going to go ahead and get our company first, get the attachments for the company, get the customer, and get the detail items. Now, these have filters on them. Okay, so if we look under the, this one doesn't have a filter. We're getting a single item. So you can see we're getting based on sold by ID. And then this, we get all the attachments for that company. So that gets us back our logo. Here in Get Customer, we're getting a single item. It's got the sold to ID, and those are from my header. Okay, and then we get the detail items. That's the one with the filter, where the invoice ID equals the ID of this header. Because I am looping through these to create an array for my list items that I'm going to use as my details, I actually have to clear that array at some point. And otherwise, what would happen by the 4th invoice, right? We'd have all of the details for all of the invoices. Okay, so this is again just kind of because I'm running on a schedule and I'm doing these in bulk. The way to clear an array is to create an empty array, right? Like this, plain empty array, and then we set the array to the value of that, okay? So that's just a little anomaly here based on the way I've structured this. For each detail item, we have got to create our array of items that we are going to use for our row details. You need to be sure, and I say this because I could not figure out why my details were coming back blank. You need to be sure that these are correct, okay? Those names right there need to match these names in here. So if you had named this my invoice detail description for whatever odd reason, you would come over here and this would say my invoice detail description, okay? And yes, this is JSON. Don't let JSON stress you out. You learned XPath, you learned XML, you can learn JSON. So here we've got our JSON, and basically, again, we've got little key value pairs. So here's the name of the thing from our template, and here's the value of the thing from our dynamic data. Units and price and row grand total are numbers, so they don't have quotes around them. Description is text, so it does have quotes around it. And now I have created an array that I can use. My row grand total is just my variable. I wonder why I'm setting it to 1. Curious, that looks like a bug. I'll fix that before I send you my output. I wonder if, oh, I remember it was frustrating me. Yes, okay, and then we're incrementing the grand total by the row grand total. Okay, that's confusing. I'll fix, oh, no, that makes sense. Okay, so I'll make sure this is all squared away before I send it to you. But basically what I'm doing is I'm incrementing these variables to add up the total of all the items and to make sure we get the total here for each row. Okay, now I think I remember why I did this. I was having a problem in Flow where it wasn't letting me do my multiplication of units times price. That's what my problem was. I was getting an error when I did units times price. It was telling me that I needed a number there, and I was thinking it was just some Flow flakiness. Remember when you're doing math in Flow that you can't actually do blank times blank. You have to go with these functions like mul. And so let me go find my detail items. I'm going to just do it. We'll do it live. We'll see if it works. New, it does not want me to do that. Okay, hang on, guys. Patience is a virtue. But I'm just going to copy this. 1 second, and bore you to death. And let's see what we've got here. Okay, so here's units and price. So I think it would be mul units times price. Okay, I'll fix that before I send it to you. For right now, we'll set that back to 1. So at any rate, I'm just populating this array. The next thing I have to do is get the logo. So attachments are repeating by their nature. Okay, so your list attachments are repeating. I don't care if you've only attached 1. Flow thinks there could be many of them. So that's why we've got another loop here. We get the attachment content. We populate the invoice template. So here is my attachment content. I'm getting back the attachment for that particular attachment. And then I'm populating my invoice template. Here's the fun part. Now, you select your location, right? That's your SharePoint site. You select your document library. You select your file. Now we start adding all of our things. Remember how I mentioned that these were kind of key value pairs? So if I take this out, I'm going to just copy this because I'm really not interested in having to go find it in the dynamic content. If I take that out, you see how it shows US dollars, right? And that's what we had in the field. Or if we go down to customer name, let me copy that again. Control C. All right. You see how it shows Wile E. Coyote, just like it did in my template. So that's why I suggest you keep your text available. If you have text in there when you go to set these up, I think it's a lot easier to look at. For my date, I'm using format date time. This variable of grand total, which we've been incrementing by row total as we go through each detail item, that becomes my grand total. I'm using some information from the invoice for the file name. Be sure when you're using data from your data source for things like folders or file names that you don't have any characters that aren't going to be valid. I initially had invoice numbers with slashes in them and I had problems with my flow. Okay, so you might need to make something file name or folder name safe. Then I create the Word document. I save that Word document up to SharePoint. This action of populating the Word template, that doesn't put it anywhere. That just populates the Word template, right? If you want to go put it somewhere, you have to go put it somewhere. And then this step is extremely simple where we're converting it to PDF, right? We've got the invoice number and the file name as part of our file path. We convert it and then we save it. Yes, okay, so here's where we're getting the Word file that we've already saved up there. And then we are creating the PDF. Now, Yeah, that's the way it works. Sorry, you do have to save the Word doc. I'm like, wait, but wait. No, you do have to save the Word doc. So I guess if you don't want the Word doc in your file system, you could add another step to go delete it. The reason I use a file name variable is because I'm using it a bunch of places. And here in Populate Invoice Template, the one last thing I wanted to show you was our logo. So here is our logo, and it's just the attachment content. Works just easily as that with an attachment. So we're going to hit the test button and we're going to generate some invoices. I'll perform the trigger action and we'll just hit run. So these guys are going to get dumped over here in my invoices, and we should be seeing folders with files anytime now. One thing about using a schedule for this is that okay, done. One thing about using a schedule for this or a button for your trigger is it makes it really easy for you to test. You can just push the button, and then when you need to change it, you can go back and you can delete this trigger and use what you really need for your trigger. So a lot of times I will start with something like with a button or a schedule. I tend to use a schedule and not a button. Let's just see if anybody's dropped in here yet so we can start looking at invoices, and then we will call this a done demo. Okay, so you can see here's my folder name. It starts with the invoice information. You can add, I did not add, but you can add steps to then populate metadata if you would like those. I just have my Word file at this point, so hopefully my PDF is going to show up soon. Let me go see what this guy is doing. It is in no hurry to help me out here, is it? Okay, well, while it's running, if you have any questions, just go ahead and holler. I'm going to let this run and pop over to the next slide because I want to let's see, I'm going to pop past this one. You guys will holler if you have questions, just type them into chat. I want to go through these links real quick, so let's take a look at these links and then we'll go take a look and see if we've got some PDFs to look at. So here's some recently released documentation and white papers that might be of use to you. There's an announcement on the add-on allocation for things that you may need now that the licensing model has changed. This is a licensing guide. It's, I don't know, quite a few pages, 23, 40, something like that. But, you know, it's not a terrible read, worth reading. Release Wave 2, so that's what we're in right now. That occurred here in October. There's an overview, there's a PDF, there's an announcement page, and there's some specific product guides. I've got links all for you. For development, there's a white paper recently released on enterprise-ready flows. It's, I think, 80 some pages. I've started reading it. It's worthwhile. And there's the blog announcement that's kind of the high level. And finally, I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of this Power Apps community plan. It's free. So if you would like to try Power Apps and Flow and so forth, there is a free plan you can sign up for that then allows you to do the things you need. My Flow run failed, you guys. Why? Why did it fail? Let us go see. Did they all fail? How horrifying. Previous. Oh, get logo and create PDF. What did it not like here? Convert to PDF. There was an error accessing the file. Please try again or select a different file. Well, that's lovely. I wanted to show you some PDFs. I have some in my recycle bin because this was working yesterday when I ran it. But let us, oh, there we go. Yay. Okay, hey, as long as I've got one PDF to show you, I'm happy. Okay, so you can see that we've got the dynamic logo, we've got the information of sold to, we've got all of our dates formatted the way we want to, and we've got the information that came from our actual invoice. The payment terms were based on customer, and over here you can see this is euro per unit, even though, yeah, I know he's in California, whatever. So you can see that we've got this changed. My totals and grand totals are wrong as per what we saw there, but at least we've made some headway. So if anybody has any questions, oh, the little sad face from Kathy. Thank you. Yeah, I know. We always feel like that when our flows fail, especially when we're demoing. But you know what? At least we got one invoice out of this. And I will, before I export this thing for you guys again, I will go fix that grand total situation. I'm trying to think if I had any other kind of gotchas for you. I think my biggest gotchas were watch out for your folder paths and your file names. No, at this point, no logos in the header. I'm going to post to the forum on that because I feel like that's something they should at least know about if they don't. And make sure you're handling your repeating data appropriately. Make sure you're using the right names for things. Because yeah, my first few tests when I was like, why don't I have any detail rows? I was very confused. So that's really all I've got to show you on this. I hope it's a technique that might be useful to you. Do give it a try if you have a process like this where it's a requirement that you have something be a very specific layout. I think the maintainability for any kind of a power user is going to be pretty good because most people are familiar with Word. So I encourage you to give it a try. You guys, I had another poll for you and I forgot to run it, and I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I'm just going to do launch. All right. And so what I'm curious about is what your flow experience level is. You know, I saw that quite a few people are using it. I'm curious if people aren't using it because it's not available, or if they're not using it because it's unfamiliar, or you know, if they are really using it heavily. So it's definitely, I think, a huge improvement over SharePoint Designer workflows. I never loved those, and I adore Flow. Just the flexibility and the creativity you can have with Flow is amazing to me. So I encourage you to find a way to try it, right? If you haven't already, give it a shot. Do check out Forms Viewer if you haven't already. We've got this great migration path for you. We've got new features coming up all the time. We just released 4.2. It's available in the store for you. So do check it out. And also, please, 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 after the webinar, take the survey. Let me know what you're interested in and kind of more what level of where you want to go to. I saw a really cool demo the other day on using cognitive services for translating an entire Power App, and I would love to do something like that if it's of interest to you. Or flow error handling, right? I really think we should talk about how do we best handle our flow errors and what are some of the gotchas there. So let me know what you're interested in, because I love having topics that are of interest to you. And I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm going to go fix that math problem in my flow before I repackage it up and send it out to you. I'll talk to you later. Bye.